The flash is blinding, a miniature sun that explodes and vanishes, leaving phantom spots dancing in my vision. The photographer, a man with a manicured beard and an overly enthusiastic voice, chirps, "Beautiful, just beautiful. Ethan, a little more connection with Clara. Leo, chin up just a fraction, champ." I feel the warmth of the studio lights on my skin, a dry, manufactured heat that bears no resemblance to the sun. My hand rests on my son's shoulder, the starched fabric of his white shirt crisp and perfect beneath my palm. Leo, my 9-year-old boy, stands between us, a solemn little soldier in this perfectly curated family portrait. He doesn't flinch, he doesn't smile. He just stares into the lens with an unnerving stillness that I know all too well. To my right, Clara shifts slightly, the ivory satin of her dress rustling like a soft sigh. I can smell her perfume, a subtle scent of gardenia and something else, something wild and green like a forest after the rain. Her hand finds mine, her fingers lacing through my own with a practiced ease that still, after a full year, feels like a beautiful, impossible lie. The photographer clicks away, capturing this image of us, Ethan Hayes, the successful architect, with his radiant wife and handsome son. A portrait of quiet wealth, of elegant stability, a testament to a life rebuilt. But as another flash detonates, all I can see is the ghost of a different night. A night of relentless rain, of desperation and whiskey, of a neon-lit chapel, and a vow that was meant to be a joke. If this photographer, if anyone in this polished world, knew the truth, that the single dad in the designer jacket had spent one night with the homeless woman in the beautiful dress and woken up married to her, this entire charade would shatter like cheap glass. This perfect picture is a masterpiece of fiction, and only the three of us know how it really began. If you've ever felt like your life was a carefully constructed building that was suddenly hit by an earthquake, do me a favor and hit that like button, because you'll understand the story I'm about to tell. To understand the weight of that camera flash, to see the truth behind this perfect picture, we have to go back 365 days, to a Tuesday night in November, when the city of Seattle was trying its best to drown itself. The rain wasn't the gentle, misty drizzle the postcards promise. It was a furious, biblical downpour. It hammered against the roof of my car, a relentless drumming that matched the pounding in my skull. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle, smearing the neon-slicked streets of downtown into abstract watercolors. I was 41 years old, a widower for 3, and the silence in my passenger seat was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket I'd grown accustomed to. My son, Leo, was at home with Mrs. Gable, the latest in a string of efficient, emotionally distant nannies. He was another cog in the perfectly managed, soul-crushingly empty machine I had built around our shared grief. My life was as meticulously designed as the sterile glass and steel homes I created for Seattle's tech millionaires. All clean lines, cold surfaces, and no room for mess. No room for life. I was driving back from Portland, a 4-hour crawl up the I-5 that had only amplified my sense of failure. The pitch for the Riverside condo project, the one that was supposed to be my comeback, my masterpiece, had been a disaster. The clients wanted warmth, character, a soul. I'd given them minimalist perfection, a monument of concrete and light. They looked at me as if I didn't speak their language. Maybe I didn't anymore. The language of human connection felt foreign on my tongue. The language I spoke was one of load-bearing walls and structural integrity, of things that could be calculated and controlled. Grief had hollowed me out, leaving behind a functional shell. I was a good father in the practical sense. Leo had organic meals, top-rated schools, and a structured schedule. But the warmth, the soul they wanted in their building, I couldn't find it for my own son, let alone for a client. The traffic light at Mercer Street turned red, and my imported sedan hummed to a stop. The city bled colors on my windshield. Red taillights, green signals, the stark white of a crosswalk sign. And it was in that chaotic wash of light that I saw her. She was huddled under the flimsy, faded blue awning of a closed bookstore, a place called The Last Page. The name felt like a cruel joke. The rain was blowing sideways, and the awning offered almost no protection. She was soaked through, a thin jacket clinging to her frame, her hair plastered to her face. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small, to disappear into the grimy brick wall behind her. My headlights swept across her for a brief second as I stopped, and her face was illuminated. She looked up, not at me, but at the deluge, and there was something in her expression that wasn't despair. It was defiance, a fierce, stubborn dignity that seemed to be in a personal battle with the storm itself. Her jaw was set, her eyes narrowed against the wind. She wasn't just enduring the rain, she was fighting it. I don't know what happened inside me in that moment. For 3 years I had driven these streets with blinders on. I saw the city as a series of lines and grids, a problem to be navigated. The people were just obstacles, shadows moving on the periphery. But I saw her, really saw her, and I did something that violated every single rule of my controlled, insulated existence. I did something the old Ethan, the pre-grief Ethan, might have done. Before the light could turn green, I steered the car to the curb, the tires hissing through a deep puddle. I put the car in park and pressed the button to lower the passenger side window. The sound of the rain roared into the silent cabin. "Excuse me," I called out. She flinched, her head snapping toward me. Her eyes were wide, a startling shade of green, and filled with the immediate ingrained suspicion of someone who expects nothing but trouble from the world. She didn't respond, just watched me, tensed like a cornered animal. "You're going to freeze out here," I said, my voice sounding rusty from disuse. "Let me give you a ride. Get you a hot meal, a hotel room for the night, anything. Just get out of this storm." She stared at me, her gaze sweeping over the expensive car, my tailored suit, my clean-shaven face. I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the weighing of risks. Kindness from a stranger in a luxury car, especially for a woman in her position, often came with a heavy, unspoken price. I expected her to say no, to curse at me, to run. It's what I would have done. "I don't need your money," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, though raspy from the cold. "I don't want a hotel." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of principle, a line drawn in the wet pavement. I respected it more than she could ever know. "Okay," I said, holding my hands up in a gesture of surrender. "No hotel, no money, but the meal is non-negotiable." I was going to grab something anyway. "There's a 24-hour diner a few blocks from here. They have coffee that can strip paint, but it's hot, please." I tried to put every ounce of sincerity I had left into that single word. The defiance in her posture flickered, replaced by a wave of shivering that racked her entire body. She looked from my face to the warm, dry interior of the car, then back at the relentless, punishing rain. It was a long moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. Finally, with a slow, deliberate nod, she pushed herself to her feet. She walked to the car and pulled the door open, hesitating for a second before sliding into the leather seat. She closed the door, and the roar of the storm was once again reduced to a distant drumming. She brought the cold and the damp with her, the smell of wet wool and rain-soaked concrete filling my pristine car, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like someone had let a little bit of the real world in. "My name is Ethan," I said, pulling back into traffic. She was staring out the window, watching the city lights smear past. "Clara," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Her eyes, I could see in the reflection, held a story far older than her 27 years. The diner was exactly as I'd described it, a relic from another era, buzzing with fluorescent lights that were too bright and smelling of stale coffee and fried bacon. We slid into a booth with cracked red vinyl seats. Clara wrapped her hands around the thick ceramic mug of coffee the waitress slammed down in front of us, as if trying to absorb all its warmth directly into her bones. She'd taken off her wet jacket, revealing a thin, worn sweater. She still shivered occasionally, but her eyes had lost their hunted look, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. I ordered pancakes for both of us, and for a while we sat in a silence that was different from the one in my car. This wasn't an empty silence. It was a cautious one, a space where two people from different universes were trying to figure out the rules of engagement. I broke it first. I talked about architecture, about the failed meeting in Portland, keeping it superficial, safe. But then, without meaning to, I started talking about Leo, about how he draws all the time, but only in shades of grey and black, about the gaping, unfixable hole my wife's absence had carved into our lives. The words just tumbled out, things I hadn't even said to my own therapist. I wasn't looking for pity. I think I was just looking for a witness, someone to hear it who wasn't being paid to listen. Clara listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She just watched my face, her green eyes seeming to understand the shape of the words I couldn't find. When I finally ran out of steam, she began to speak. Her voice was low, and she told me about a different kind of loss. Not of a person, but of a future. She spoke of a promising art scholarship to a prestigious school in New York, a dream she'd worked her entire life for. She spoke of a sudden car accident that hadn't taken her life, but had taken her parents, and left her with a mountain of debt and no family to lean on. She described the slippery, terrifying slope that followed, from a friend's couch to her car, and finally to the unforgiving streets of Seattle. There was no self-pity in her story, only a blunt, factual recounting of a life derailed. As she spoke, I saw the artist in her, the girl who saw the world in color and form, now trapped in a monochrome existence, just like my son. We were two strangers in a cheap diner at 2 in the morning, but the chasm between my world of glass houses and her world of concrete sidewalks began to shrink. There was a raw, unvarnished recognition between us, two people profoundly, hopelessly adrift in the storms of our own lives. The pancakes arrived, and as we ate, a strange, reckless energy began to build in the space between us, a spark in the dark. It was fueled by exhaustion, by the shared vulnerability, and by a desperate, unspoken craving for a single night of escape. One night where we could pretend to be someone else, anyone else, other than the broken people we were. The pancakes were gone, leaving behind sticky constellations of syrup on our plates. The diner's late-night population had thinned out, leaving just us, a lone trucker nursing a coffee at the counter, and the weary-eyed waitress wiping down tables. The idea of the night ending felt like a physical threat. For me, it meant returning to a house that was big, empty and silent, except for the ghosts of my own making. For Clara, it meant returning to the street, to the cold, unforgiving rain. The fragile bubble of warmth and connection we'd created in this cheap vinyl booth was about to pop, and neither of us wanted to be the one to do it. "I should probably get you somewhere for the night," I said, the words feeling like a betrayal. I was trying to be responsible, to put the world back on its axis, but every part of me rebelled against it. Clara looked down at her empty coffee cup. "Somewhere," she repeated, the word hollow. "Yeah." She didn't look at me, but I saw her shoulders slump, the defiant energy that had burned so brightly now just a low ember. The armor was going back up. The thought was unbearable. "Or," I said, the word hanging in the air, a crazy, impulsive alternative. We don't end the night." She finally looked up, her green eyes searching mine for the punchline. She found none. "What does that mean, Ethan?" she asked, her voice quiet. "It means I don't want to go home to my empty house, and I sure as hell don't want you going back out into that storm. So we just drive. No destination, just movement. We outrun the morning for a few more hours." It was the most irrational, irresponsible thing I could have possibly suggested. I had a son at home. I had a multi-million-dollar company to run. And yet the idea felt more essential than breathing. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine, unguarded smile I'd seen from her. It transformed her. The weariness fell away, and for a second, I saw the 27-year-old artist, the girl with a scholarship to New York and a future full of color. "Outrun the morning," she mused. "I like that. Okay, architect. Let's drive." I paid the bill, leaving a $50 tip that made the waitress's eyes widen, and we walked back out into the night. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, and the city air felt clean and new. Back in the car, the silence was different again. It was charged, humming with possibility. I drove aimlessly, following the green lights, heading south out of the city with no map and no plan. We talked. Not about our losses, we'd already laid those bare. We talked about the things that made us feel alive. She told me about the smell of oil paints, the feel of charcoal under her fingernails, the way light hit the Cascade Mountains at sunrise. I told her about the thrill of seeing a blueprint come to life, the perfect, satisfying geometry of a well-designed space, a passion I thought had died with my wife. In the glove compartment was a silver flask, a wedding gift from years ago, still half full of an expensive single malt whiskey. I hadn't touched it in 3 years. On a whim, I pulled it out. "Emergency rations," I said, offering it to her. She took it without hesitation, unscrewed the cap and took a long, steady pull, her throat moving gracefully. She handed it back to me with a little gasp. "Wow, that's not diner coffee." I took a sip myself, the fiery liquid burning a welcome trail down my chest, chasing away the last vestiges of rationality. We passed the flask back and forth as the miles dissolved behind us. The whiskey, combined with our exhaustion and the hypnotic rhythm of the highway, created a strange, intoxicating cocktail. We were laughing now, loud and unrestrained. We told bad jokes. We shared stupid stories from our childhoods. We were two strangers playing pretend, acting like we didn't have a care in the world. It felt realer than anything I had experienced in years. If you've ever had a moment where you just wanted to hit a giant reset button on your life, to do something so completely out of character that no one would recognize you, you understand the feeling that was building in that car. It was a giddy, terrifying freedom. Let me know in the comments what's the craziest, most impulsive thing you've ever wanted to do, because we were about to top it. We crossed the state line into Washington, somewhere south of Olympia, where the towns got smaller and the streetlights farther apart. And then we saw it. A glowing, garish billboard cutting through the dark, rainy night. It depicted a cartoon Cupid firing an arrow at a pair of interlocking gold rings. In huge, flashing neon letters, it read, "Tumwater Twist of Fate Chapel, get hitched in a hurry, open 24/7, next exit." I started laughing, a deep, incredulous laugh. It was the tackiest, most absurd thing I had ever seen. "Look at that," I said, pointing. "Who in their right mind would do that?" Clara was staring at the sign, but she wasn't laughing. There was a strange, thoughtful look on her face. "Maybe people who aren't in their right mind," she said softly. "Maybe people who are tired of being sensible. People who want, just for one night, to have a story no one would believe." The joke died on my lips. The car hummed along the empty highway. The flashing neon sign grew closer. The suggestion hung in the air between us. A wild, impossible dare. It was insane. It was career suicide. It was social and legal immolation. It was, without a doubt, the single worst idea I had ever heard in my entire life. "Take the exit," she whispered. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The logical part of my brain, the architect, was screaming, sounding alarms, flashing red lights. This is a mistake. A colossal, life-altering mistake. Think of Leo. Think of your reputation. But the other part of me, the part that had been dormant for 3 years, the part that was raw and grieving and desperate for a single irrational act of life, was already turning the wheel. The car veered onto the exit ramp. The Tumwater Twist of Fate Chapel was even more glorious and horrifying up close. It was a tiny A-frame building painted Pepto-Bismol pink, with a flickering neon heart over the door. The parking lot was empty, save for a beat-up pickup truck. Inside, the place smelled of dust and cheap air freshener. The decor was a riot of plastic flowers, peeling gold-painted cherubs, and red velvet curtains. Behind a small counter sat a man who looked like he'd been personally disappointed by every decision humanity had ever made. He wore a stained tuxedo t-shirt and was reading a dog-eared paperback novel. He didn't look up when we entered. "Are you here for the I do or I don't package?" he droned, his voice thick with boredom. $75 includes the ceremony, digital photo, and your choice of 2 rings from the display." He gestured with his thumb towards a rotating glass case filled with the saddest-looking rings I had ever seen. Clara and I looked at each other, and the sheer, unadulterated madness of it all hit us. We burst into hysterical laughter. We laughed so hard, tears streamed down our faces. The man behind the counter just stared at us, utterly unimpressed. "So is that a yes or a no on the package?" "It's a yes," I managed to say, wiping a tear from my eye. "A definite yes." The next 20 minutes were a surreal blur. We filled out a form that asked for fewer details than my dry cleaner. We picked out 2 identical, simple gold-plated bands from the dusty case. They felt light and cheap in my hand, like toys from a Cracker Jack box. The man whose name tag identified him as Reverend Ron led us into the chapel itself. It was a small room with 6 plastic chairs and an altar covered in more fake roses. He sighed heavily, put his book down, and had us stand in front of him. "Dearly beloved," or whatever, he began reading from a laminated card. His voice was a monotone drone, devoid of any emotion or inflection. He mumbled his way through a generic speech about love and commitment, words that had absolutely no connection to the 2 strangers standing before him, still giddy with whiskey and adrenaline. I looked at Clara. The neon light from outside cast a pink glow on her face. She was still smiling, but there was something else in her eyes now, a vulnerability, a flicker of genuine emotion that cut through the absurdity of it all. When it came time for the vows, we just repeated the lines Reverend Ron fed us. They were hollow words, a script in a play, but as I said them, looking into her eyes, a strange thing happened. For a fleeting second, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a promise to a fellow survivor, a pact to get through the night. I now pronounce you married, I guess, Ron concluded with a shrug. You can kiss her. $75, cash or card. We walked out of the chapel and back into the rain, the cheap rings feeling impossibly heavy on our fingers. The high of the moment was still with us, but it was starting to be edged with a profound sense of, what have we done? We got back in the car and I just started driving back towards the city. We didn't talk about it, we couldn't. There were no words for what had just happened. It was too big, too stupid, too real. I ended up at the hotel where I was supposed to have stayed in Portland, but there was an affiliate in Seattle. My keycard was still in my wallet. My bag was still in the trunk. It seemed like the only logical place to go, in a night that had been devoid of all logic. The room was sterile and impersonal, a beige box with a king-sized bed and a generic print of a mountain on the wall. It was the kind of room I'd spent hundreds of nights in for work, but it had never felt so alien. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The weight of our separate lives, the ones we'd tried to outrun, was waiting for us just outside the door. Clara stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. I could only see her silhouette. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say, so I just said her name. Clara. She turned around. We looked at each other across the room, two people bound together by a ridiculous, legally binding act of rebellion. And then we simply collapsed into bed, too tired to speak, too overwhelmed to think. The last thing I remember was the strange, unfamiliar feeling of another person's warmth beside me, a small island in an ocean of exhaustion. Then, nothing, just a deep, dreamless blackness. The first thing I registered was the light. A cruel grey morning light filtering through a gap in the hotel curtains, piercing my eyelids. The second thing was the pain. A dull, throbbing headache that felt like a tiny blacksmith was forging a horseshoe inside my skull. My mouth was dry, tasting of stale whiskey and regret. I groaned, rolling onto my back. The sheets were tangled around my legs, and the bed felt wrong. It wasn't my bed at home. The smell was wrong. The air was wrong. And I wasn't alone. I turned my head slowly, every muscle protesting. She was there, Clara, asleep on her side, facing away from me, her dark hair fanned out across the pillow. For a moment she looked peaceful, the hard lines of defiance on her face softened by sleep. Fragments of the night came rushing back in a chaotic, nauseating flood. The diner, the rain, the flask, the flashing neon sign, Reverend Ron. Oh, God. It wasn't a dream. I pushed myself up on one elbow, my head spinning. It was a mistake. A huge, drunken, catastrophic mistake. I looked down at my left hand, resting on the white hotel comforter, and my blood ran cold. Gleaming in the pale morning light, sitting on my ring finger, was a simple, cheap, and undeniably real gold band. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. It was a physical sensation, an icy grip around my lungs that squeezed the air out. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I looked from the ring on my hand to the sleeping woman beside me, then to the nightstand. And there it was, sitting next to my wallet and keys like a death sentence. A crisp, folded piece of paper with an official-looking seal, the marriage certificate. The reality of it was as stark and unforgiving as the hangover pounding behind my eyes. Single dad spent a night with a homeless woman. He never met before, and woke up married. The headline screamed in my mind, a tabloid nightmare brought to life. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated damage control. My mind, the architect's mind, started racing, calculating angles, assessing structural weaknesses, formulating a plan to demolish this catastrophe before it could bring my entire, carefully constructed life crashing down. Call my lawyer, Andrew. That was step one. He specialized in corporate law, not this, but he was discreet. He would know who to call. Annulment. That had to be the solution. A quick, quiet erasure. We could argue temporary insanity, intoxication. Both were undeniably true. We could make this disappear. No one ever had to know. The plan was clean, efficient. It was a legal demolition. I eased myself out of the bed, moving with the stealth of a burglar. The floor was cold under my bare feet. I found my pants slung over a chair and slid them on, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I had to get away from the certificate, from the ring, from the sleeping evidence of my monumental lapse in judgment. I crept towards the bathroom, planning to lock myself inside and make the call that would rewind the last 12 hours. But as my hand closed around the cool metal of the doorknob, I made the mistake of looking back. Clara had shifted in her sleep, rolling onto her back. One arm was flung over her head, her hand resting limply on the pillow. The morning light fell across her face, and for the first time I saw her without the mask of defiance or the haze of whiskey. She looked young, younger than 27, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked utterly peaceful. The lines of tension around her mouth were gone. The guarded watchfulness in her brow had smoothed out. In sleep, she was just a woman, vulnerable and unguarded, and she wasn't a problem to be solved. She was the person who had listened to me in that diner, with an attentiveness no one had shown me in 3 years. She was the one who had laughed with me in the car, a real, unburdened laugh that had momentarily made me forget the weight I carried. She was the other half of our shared, insane act of rebellion against the quiet desperation of our lives. My finger hovered over Andrew's number on my phone screen. I couldn't press it. Calling him felt like a betrayal, not of a marriage, which was a farce, but of that fragile, fleeting connection we had forged in the dead of night. It felt like reducing a human being to a legal inconvenience to be tidied up and swept away. My plan, so clean and efficient a moment ago, now felt cruel and cowardly. I lowered the phone. What was I supposed to do? Wake her up and say, "Thanks for the crazy night, my lawyer will be in touch to erase you from my life"? Drive her back to that same street corner and leave her in the rain, now with the added insult of a sham marriage? The thought turned my stomach. I was still a fool, an idiot who had made a catastrophic mistake. But I couldn't be that man. I couldn't be that cruel. So, standing there in the cold silence of the hotel room, I made another impulsive decision, one that piled recklessness on top of recklessness. It wasn't a plan. It was a stay of execution, a temporary, insane solution to an impossible problem. I waited. I ordered room service, coffee and toast, and sat in the armchair watching her sleep, the cheap gold band on my finger feeling like a brand. When she finally stirred, it was with a soft groan. She sat up slowly, blinking against the light, her hair a wild tangle. She looked around the unfamiliar room, her eyes wide with confusion, and then she saw me. The memory hit her all at once. I saw it register on her face, the shock, the dawning horror. Her eyes darted to her own left hand and she let out a small, choked sound. "Oh no," she whispered, burying her face in her hands. "Please tell me we didn't." I gestured grimly towards the certificate on the nightstand. She looked at it and all the color drained from her face. She started, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, this is my fault. I don't know what I was thinking." She started scrambling for her clothes, which were in a damp pile on the floor. "I'll go. We can just pretend this never happened. I won't tell anyone, I swear." She was moving with a frantic energy, a desperate need to escape the scene of the crime. She looked like a cornered animal again, and I hated it. "Clara, wait," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "Stop, just sit down for a minute." She froze, her hand halfway to her jacket, and looked at me, her eyes filled with shame and panic. "Let's not panic," I said, the words sounding absurd even to my own ears. "We panicked last night. Let's try not panicking this morning." I explained my new half-baked idea. Annulment was still the end goal, I assured her, but it could get messy. A millionaire architect marrying a homeless woman in a drunken haze. It was a story the media would devour. It could affect my business, and more importantly, it could drag her through a public nightmare she didn't deserve. So, I proposed a temporary, tactical alliance. "Come back to Seattle with me," I said, the words feeling foreign and insane as they left my mouth. "Just for a few days, a week maybe. We present a calm, united front, while my lawyer works quietly behind the scenes to undo this. We stage a quick, amicable separation. No scandal, no drama. You stay at my house. You'll have a room, food, a safe place to be while we sort this out. Then we go our separate ways. No one gets hurt." She stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. "Stay with you? In your house? Ethan, that's crazy." "Crazier than getting married to a complete stranger in a pink chapel in Tumwater," I countered, raising an eyebrow. She had no answer to that. I could see the conflict in her eyes. The idea was insane, But for her, it also represented a warm bed, hot meals, a roof over her head, a brief respite from the brutal reality of the street. It was an offer of sanctuary, wrapped in the guise of a mutually beneficial, albeit bizarre, legal strategy. "Just for a week," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Until the lawyers figure it out?" "That's the deal," I confirmed. She took a deep breath, a long, shuddering sigh, and gave a single, hesitant nod. The drive back to my house was the most awkward, silent 4 hours of my life. The easy camaraderie of the previous night had evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating cloud of regret and uncertainty. We were no longer two rebels on a joyride. We were two co-conspirators in a terrible decision, now facing the consequences. When I pulled into the long, winding driveway of my home, Clara just stared. The house was one of my own designs, a sprawling, minimalist structure of glass, steel, and cedar, perched on a bluff overlooking Puget Sound. It was beautiful, I knew that objectively. It had been featured in architectural magazines, but it was also cold, severe, and unwelcoming. It was a monument, not a home. "You live here," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "I exist here," I corrected her, turning off the engine. The silence that descended was absolute. When we walked through the front door, the silence followed us inside. The cavernous, open-plan living room with its 20-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to amplify the emptiness. The air was still and sterile. It was the house of a man who had forgotten how to live. And then, a small figure appeared at the top of the floating steel staircase. Leo. He was holding his sketchbook, and he stopped dead when he saw us, his eyes wide. He looked from me to the strange woman standing beside me, taking in her worn clothes and tangled hair. His gaze was not curious. It was deeply, profoundly distrustful. "Leo," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the silent house. "This is Clara. She's a friend. She's going to be staying with us for a little while." Leo didn't say a word. He just clutched his sketchbook tighter, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Clara not as a guest, but as an invader, an unknown variable in his carefully controlled grayscale world. An awkward, painful silence stretched between the three of us. And then it was broken by a new voice, sharp and clipped. "Ethan, is that you? Your nanny called. She said you never came home last night." I was about to call the police. Amelia, my sister-in-law, swept into the room from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was the polar opposite of her late sister. Where my wife had been warm and bohemian, Amelia was sharp angles and icy precision. Since her sister's death, she had appointed herself the self-proclaimed guardian of her memory, a memory she curated with the ferocity of a museum director protecting a priceless artifact. Her eyes landed on Clara, and her perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up towards her hairline. Her gaze raked over Clara from head to toe, a swift, brutal appraisal that was 1,000 times more insulting than any words could be. She took in the cheap clothes, the exhaustion in Clara's face, and then her eyes locked onto the simple gold band on Clara's left hand. A flash of disbelief, followed by pure, unadulterated fury. She looked at the identical ring on my hand, and her face hardened into a mask of cold contempt. "Ethan," she said, her voice dangerously low and sweet. "Who is this?" The lie I had prepared, the simple, "she's a friend," died on my lips. Amelia wouldn't buy it for a second. The rings told a different story. And in that moment I realized my plan to keep this quiet was a fantasy. Amelia was the town crier of our social circle. There was no containing this. "Amelia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Clara Hayes, my wife." The words felt like ash in my mouth. Clara flinched beside me as if she'd been struck. Leo's sketchbook slipped from his fingers and clattered down 2 steps of the steel staircase. But the most terrifying reaction came from Amelia. She didn't yell, she didn't scream, she just smiled. It was a thin, bloodless smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a predator that had just found its prey. "Your wife," she repeated slowly, savoring the word. "How wonderful. We must celebrate." She looked at Clara, her eyes glittering with malice. "Welcome to the family." It was not a welcome. It was a declaration of war. In that moment, I understood that the immediate and most formidable obstacle we faced was not the law or the press, or even my withdrawn, grieving son. It was the woman standing in my kitchen, who saw Clara not as a person, but as a parasite, a gold digger who had sunk her claws into a vulnerable millionaire. And I knew, with a sickening certainty that she would stop at absolutely nothing to tear our ridiculous accidental marriage and Clara herself to shreds. The next few days were a masterclass in passive aggression, orchestrated by Amelia with the precision of a seasoned general. She didn't confront me directly again. Her methods were far more insidious. She became a constant, smiling presence in my house, a beautifully dressed viper coiling herself around the heart of my home. She would arrive in the mornings under the guise of helping out, her voice a syrupy confection of concern. "Oh, Ethan, you look so tired. This whole situation must be so draining for you," she'd say, loud enough for Clara, who would be sitting awkwardly in the vast living room, to hear every word. She brought over casseroles and baked goods, offerings of supposed support that felt more like territorial markings. She treated Clara with a kind of weaponized politeness that was more demeaning than open hostility. She'd offer her clothes, her late sister's clothes, with a sigh. "You poor thing, you must have nothing to wear. I am sure we can find something of Sarah's that would fit." Each gesture was a poisoned dart, designed to remind Clara of her status as an outsider, a charity case, a usurper. The whispers started almost immediately. Amelia's phone calls were never ending, her voice a low conspiratorial murmur from the kitchen or the patio. I didn't have to hear the words to know their content. The story she was weaving was predictable and poisonous. The grieving, vulnerable widower, taken advantage of by a cunning, desperate street person, a con artist who had masterfully trapped a millionaire. The narrative was simple, ugly, and effective. The proof was in the sudden chill from my social and professional circles, a call from a board member at the firm, ostensibly about a project, but his tone was strained, his questions about my well-being laden with unspoken meaning. An invitation to a dinner party was rescinded at the last minute due to a sudden plumbing issue. I was being subtly quarantined, my world shrinking as Amelia's version of the truth spread like a virus. Through it all, I was consumed with damage control. I spent hours on the phone with Andrew, my lawyer, who had transitioned from disbelief to a state of professional exasperation. The annulment was not as simple as I'd hoped. The fact that we had consummated the marriage, a detail I was forced to admit in a mortifying phone call, complicated things immensely. It moved us from the realm of a drunken mistake into something that looked, on paper, far more legitimate. "This is a mess, Ethan," Andrew had said, his voice tinny over the phone. "A genuine Class A mess. We can file for divorce, but it won't be clean. She'll have rights. Spousal support, a claim to your assets acquired during the marriage, short as it may be." The words hung in the air, confirming Amelia's narrative. Gold digger, predator. I found myself in the bizarre position of defending a woman I barely knew. "She's not like that, Andrew," I insisted, feeling foolish. "She doesn't want anything." "They never do," he'd replied, the cynicism of his profession evident in his tone. "Until they do." Lost in this legal and social quagmire, I barely noticed Clara. She was like a ghost in my minimalist mansion. She made herself small, tucking herself into corners, trying to be invisible. She ate after everyone else had finished, washed her own plate, and retreated to the guest room I'd assigned her, a sterile white box at the far end of the house. I was too busy fighting the fires Amelia was setting to pay her any real attention. I was trying to manage the fallout of our shared mistake, and in doing so, I was ignoring the person who was at the very center of the storm. I was treating her exactly as my lawyer and sister-in-law did, as a problem to be managed. And then there was Leo. My son had retreated even further into his shell. He communicated in monosyllables and spent every waking moment in his room, drawing. The door was always closed. He treated Clara with a cold, silent hostility, refusing to even look in her direction. If she was in a room, he would leave. He saw her as the invader Amelia had painted her to be, the strange woman who had inexplicably appeared and disrupted the fragile, predictable sadness of our lives. The house was a battlefield of silent tensions, a cold war fought in a glass box. The change began not with a bang, but with the soft, scratching sound of charcoal on paper. One afternoon I came home early, my head pounding from another circular conversation with Andrew. The house was, as usual, silent. I expected to find Clara in her room and Leo in his. But as I walked past the living room, I saw something that made me stop. Clara was not in her room. She was sitting on the floor, cross-legged on one of my expensive hand-woven rugs. In front of her was an old, dusty cardboard box. I recognized it instantly. It was a box of my late wife's art supplies, a collection of professional-grade charcoals, pastels, and expensive paper that had been sitting in the garage, untouched, for 3 years. I had never been able to bring myself to get rid of it. Clara had found it. She wasn't pushing or prying, she was just drawing, her head bent in concentration, her hand moving across a large sheet of paper with a forgotten fluid grace. She was completely absorbed, lost in a world of her own making. And a few feet away, near the cold, unlit fireplace, sat Leo. He wasn't in his room. He was sitting on the floor too, his own sketchbook open on his lap, but he wasn't drawing. He was watching her. His expression was no longer hostile. It was one of pure, unadulterated fascination. He was captivated, watching her hand fly across the page, leaving behind a trail of impossible, beautiful shapes. She was drawing a fantastical world, a place of soaring, feathered creatures and impossible floating islands wreathed in clouds. It was a world born from her own lost dreams, a place of freedom and wonder. I stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched them for almost an hour. They didn't speak a single word to each other. It was a silent communion. Clara drew, and Leo watched. The next day, I came home to the same scene, but with a small difference. Leo had moved closer. He was now only a few feet away from her, his own sketchbook still open but ignored, his eyes fixed on her work. On the third day, the miracle happened. I walked in, and Leo was sitting beside her, and in his hand was a piece of blue pastel from my wife's old box. As I watched, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, he leaned forward, his small hand hesitating for just a moment over her drawing. Clara didn't look up. She didn't say a word. She just kept drawing, leaving a space in the sky of her fantastical world. Leo took a breath and made a tentative, shaky blue streak across the paper, a river, flowing between two of her floating islands. Clara paused. She looked at his blue line, and then she looked at him. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then he added another streak of blue, and then a splash of yellow, a sun peeking from behind a cloud. For the first time in 3 years, my son was using color. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I came home not to a suffocating silence, but to the soft rhythmic scratch of charcoal on paper and the quiet, shared murmur of creation. I saw Leo point to a corner of the drawing and whisper something. I saw Clara whisper back, and then I saw my son smile. A real, genuine, unburdened smile. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. That was the moment my perspective shifted, irrevocably. I stopped seeing Clara as an error to be corrected, a legal problem to be managed. I started to see her as Amelia's whispers painted her, not as a predator, but as something else entirely. She was a light, a small, tenacious flame that had somehow found a crack in the fortress of grief I had built around my family, and had, against all odds, managed to rekindle something inside. She hadn't tried to fix my son. She hadn't offered him therapy or forced conversations. She had simply met him where he was, in his silent world of lines and shadows, and she had shown him the way back to color. She had done for him what an army of nannies, therapists, and a well-meaning but emotionally crippled father had failed to do. She had connected with him. This impromptu, insane marriage, born of whiskey and desperation, started to feel less like a mistake and more like a strange, accidental, and utterly terrifying miracle. And I realized that by focusing all my energy on erasing the mistake, I was in danger of erasing the miracle along with it. The annual fundraising gala for the Seattle Art Museum was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, an event I had chaired for the past 5 years. It was less about art and more about the intricate dance of wealth, status, and power. In previous years, it had been a duty I performed with detached efficiency. This year, it felt like a looming execution. The event was scheduled for Saturday, just over 3 weeks after that fateful night in Tumwater. Amelia naturally was on the gala committee, and she made her position on my attendance crystal clear. She cornered me in my own kitchen 2 days before the event, her face a mask of manufactured concern. "Ethan, darling," she began, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. "We need to talk about the gala. I think it would be best if you came alone." "Alone?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "Of course," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to present a united, respectable front. Show everyone that you're in control, that this temporary distraction is being handled. Bringing her, she said, the word dripping with disdain, would be a disaster. It would legitimize the whole sordid affair. It would be a slap in the face to Sarah's memory. The old me, the Ethan of just a few weeks ago, would have agreed instantly. It was the logical, strategic move. It would have minimized the damage, smoothed the ruffled feathers of our social circle, and reinforced the narrative that Clara was a temporary problem being dealt with. But I wasn't that Ethan anymore. Something had shifted in me, something fundamental. I had seen my son smile. I had watched this quiet, unassuming woman break through a wall of grief that I, his own father, had only managed to reinforce. The choice Amelia was presenting was no longer just a matter of social strategy. It was a choice between the pristine, ordered and suffocating world she represented and the chaotic, beautiful and unexpectedly vibrant one that had just begun to bloom within the cold walls of my own home. No, I said, the word simple and solid. If I go, Clara goes with me. Amelia's mask of concern slipped. For a fraction of a second I saw the raw fury underneath, before she quickly composed herself. "Ethan, don't be a fool," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You have no idea who this woman is. You're going to regret this. I'm only trying to protect you." "I can protect myself, Amelia," I said, my voice cold. "She is my wife. She'll be there." The next 2 days were a silent, frantic preparation for battle. I took Clara shopping. It was an excruciatingly awkward experience. She walked through the high-end boutique like a visitor in a foreign land, touching the silks and cashmeres with a kind of detached curiosity. She resisted at every turn. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. These dresses cost more than I've earned in the last year," she protested, holding up a price tag with a look of disbelief. "Just pick one, Clara," I said, more forcefully than I intended. "It's not a request. I wasn't trying to be a benefactor or a savior. I was trying to arm her. I knew the wolves would be circling at that gala, and I couldn't send her into that arena in her worn-out jeans and sweater." She finally chose the simplest dress in the store, a floor-length, sleeveless gown in a deep midnight blue. It was elegant, understated, and stunning. When she stepped out of the dressing room, I felt the air leave my lungs. The dress didn't transform her. It revealed her. It revealed the grace that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of hardship and grime. It revealed the artist, the woman of quiet strength and fierce dignity I had first seen huddled under that bookstore awning. The night of the gala, a nervous energy crackled through the house. I stood at the bottom of the steel staircase, dressed in a tuxedo, the cheap gold band on my finger feeling both absurd and profoundly right. When Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, I felt that same jolt I'd felt in the boutique. Her hair was swept up, a few loose tendrils framing her face. She wore no jewelry except for the simple gold ring. She was breathtaking, but it wasn't just the dress. There was a new light in her eyes, a quiet confidence she hadn't possessed a few weeks ago. The artist was re-emerging from the survivor. She walked down the stairs, and Leo stood in the doorway of the living room, watching her. His eyes were wide, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something akin to pride in his expression. As we were about to leave, Leo ran up to Clara and shyly handed her a folded piece of paper. "For good luck," he mumbled, before retreating back into the shadows. Clara unfolded it. It was a drawing in vibrant color of one of her soaring, feathered creatures, its wings spread wide against a brilliant yellow sun. Clara's eyes welled with tears. She carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into her small clutch. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered. It was more than a drawing. It was a blessing. Walking into the grand ballroom of the museum was like stepping into a shark tank. The vast, vaulted room, filled with the city's elite, fell into a sudden, conspicuous hush as we entered. It was a ripple effect, a murmur starting at the door and spreading through the crowd until hundreds of pairs of eyes were fixed on us, on me, and on the unknown, beautiful woman on my arm. I could feel their stares like physical blows, a mixture of shock, pity, and salacious curiosity. I felt Clara's hand tremble slightly on my arm. I covered her hand with mine and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Just breathe," I murmured, for her benefit as much as my own. We walked through the gauntlet, my head held high, nodding politely to people whose eyes were full of judgment. And then, as I knew she would, Amelia struck. She materialized in front of us, flanked by several influential board members, including the museum's powerful chairman, a man whose opinion could make or break careers in this city. Her smile was a predatory slash of red lipstick. "Ethan! There you are," she chirped, her voice dripping with feigned delight and concern. She kissed my cheek, then turned her full, formidable attention to Clara. "And this must be the new Mrs. Hayes. We are all just so thrilled to finally meet you." Her eyes glittered, and I knew this was it. This was the moment she had been planning. She held up a manila file, tapping it with a perfectly manicured nail. "I was just so worried, Ethan," she said, her voice rising in volume, calculated to draw in the surrounding guests. People began to turn, their conversations dying down as they sensed the unfolding drama. "Your friends, we were all just so concerned for you. You've been through so much." So I took the liberty, for your protection, of course, of looking into your new wife's background. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. This was better than gossip. This was a public execution. "And I found something a little troubling," Amelia continued, opening the file with a dramatic flourish. "It seems your wife has a criminal record." She pulled out a sheet of paper, a printout from a public records database. The room was now utterly silent. The only sound was the faint clinking of ice in abandoned cocktail glasses. "An arrest," Amelia announced, her voice filled with triumphant sorrow, "for trespassing just last year, in a commercial property." She looked around at the captivated faces of the board members, painting the picture she had so carefully crafted. A desperate, transient criminal who had sunk her hooks into their grieving, vulnerable friend. The trap had been sprung. The checkmate was declared. The room waited, holding its breath, for the final, humiliating implosion. Clara's face had gone deathly pale. Her hand in mine was ice cold, but she did not shrink. She did not look away. Her spine straightened, and that fierce dignity I had seen on that first rainy night blazed in her eyes. I looked from Amelia's triumphant, venomous smirk to Clara's pained but unbroken gaze. In that single, frozen moment, everything became crystal clear. This was the choice. Between the meticulously curated lie of my old life and the messy, unpredictable truth of the new one. Between the memory of my wife as a pristine artifact guarded by Amelia and the living, breathing woman beside me who had brought my son back to life. It wasn't a choice at all. I turned to Clara, ignoring Amelia, ignoring the entire room. I looked into her eyes. "Tell them," I said softly, my voice intended for her alone. "Tell them the truth." She took a shaky breath. Then, with a voice that was quiet but carried with astonishing clarity through the silent ballroom, she began to speak. "Yes," she said, her gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of the board members. "I was arrested. It was last February, during that brutal winter freeze when the temperature dropped to 10 degrees. The city's shelters were full. Every bed was taken. I found an unlocked door in the back of a vacant warehouse, and I went inside to keep from freezing to death. I was arrested for choosing to survive." Her story hung in the air, simple, stark, and devastating. It was not a story of criminality, but of a system that had failed her. It was a story of desperation, not of deceit. It recast Amelia's accusation from a revelation of character into an act of breathtaking cruelty. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy with shame. The board members shifted uncomfortably on their feet, their expressions of shock turning to ones of deep unease. They looked at Amelia, and for the first time they saw her not as a concerned friend but as a vicious bully. Amelia's smirk faltered, her victory turning to ash in her mouth. And then I turned to her. My voice was not loud, but it was cold and clear, and carried the weight of 3 years of repressed anger and grief. "This woman," I said, my hand tightening on Clara's, "has shown more grace and kindness in 3 weeks than you have shown in 3 years. She has brought more healing into my home with a piece of charcoal than you have with all your casseroles and your poisonous whispers." I took a step forward, forcing Amelia to take a step back. "This marriage," I declared, my voice resonating in the cavernous room, "may have been an accident, but my decision to honor it is not. She is my wife. She and Leo are my family. And anyone who has a problem with that," I said, my eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of the crowd, "has a problem with me." Without waiting for a response, I turned, took Clara's hand, and led her through the parting sea of speechless guests. We walked out of the ballroom, out of the museum and back into the cool, clean night air, leaving a shattered silence and Amelia's ruined plan in our wake.